The village by day is a place of rhythm and familiarity, the ringing of the church bell, the creak of carts, the steady work of plough and spindle. But by night, when the fields lie silent and hearths glow faintly behind shuttered windows, the village is changed. Shadows stretch long, owls cry from the rafters of barns, and the lanes lie empty beneath the moon. In that silence fear takes hold, for in the dark crime lurks, petty theft, sudden violence, the quarrels of neighbors that flare into blood, or the footsteps of strangers who slip away with what is not theirs. Every villager knows the fragility of peace, a hen stolen from the coop, a loaf of bread missing from the bakehouse, a scythe gone from the barn. Such small losses weigh heavily where little can be spared. A thief in the night is not only a nuisance, but a threat to survival. A stolen sack of grain may mean hunger in winter. A broken fence may let livestock wander, their loss irreparable. So when the dog barks suddenly at midnight, when footsteps sound too close to the cottage wall, hearts beat faster and prayers rise in whispers. Theft is not the only shadow. Quarrel that begin in daylight may carry into darkness. Neighbors who disputed over a strip of land, a wandering pig, or a harsh word exchanged at the tavern may find anger burning hotter after ale has loosened tongues. Fists fly in the narrow lane, knives are drawn in sudden fury, and what was once insult becomes blood. In such moments, the darkness feels complicit, wrapping crimes in its cloak, hiding them until dawn reveals the wound, the bruise, or the corpse. Bandits to haunt the imagination. The forest beyond the fields are dense and deep, filled with the rustle of leaves and the creak of branches. Travelers whisper of men who lurk there, waiting to strike. They emerge like shadows themselves, faces hidden by hoods, knives flashing, demanding coin or goods. Though true bandit raids are rare, the fear of them is constant, for the thought of strangers lying in wait at the village edge is enough to chill the blood. The mothers hush children with warnings, "Do not stray too far, do not walk alone, for the woods are full of dangers." Yet crime is not always the act of outsiders. More often it is born within the village itself, by hands known and faces familiar. Hunger drives the poor to steal from their neighbors. Desperation leads to dishonesty in trade. Old grudges fester until anger bursts forth. To see a friend or kinsman accused is a bitter shock. Yet it happens often, for sin and want are woven into daily life, piety, labor, and prayer. When crime strikes, the alarm spreads quickly. A cry goes up, "Thief! Thief!" and doors fly open. Villagers spill into the lanes with torches, dogs barking madly. The bell in the churchyard is sometimes rung, its voice calling not to prayer but to pursuit. Men take up staves, women clutch lanterns, children huddle by hearths, and the search begins. Footsteps X through the night, the community rises together, bound by shared fear and shared anger. If the culprit is caught, the response is swift. He may be dragged to the manor house or luck in the church porch until morning, held under guard while neighbors gather to witness. Anger flares easily, cries for punishment rising from the crowd. Yet restraint too is valued, for justice belongs not to the mob but to the court. Still, the shame of being caught, bound and exposed before one own kin, is itself a punishment, a stain upon reputation that lingers long after fines are paid. But if the thief escapes, suspicion festers, whispers fill the village. Was it the poor widow with too many mouths to feed? Was it the youth known for idleness? Was it a stranger passing through or a neighbor once trusted? Eyes grow narrow, greetings colder, bonds strained. Trust once broken is not easily mended, and the shadow of crime lingers even when no proof is found. By day, the fields and cottages seem safe again. The sun chases away fear, laughter returns, and work resumes. But at dusk, when the last light fades, memory stirs. The darkness returns, carrying with it the unease that crime might once more slip through the lanes, unseen until too late. And so villagers bar doors, set dogs to watch, and whisper prayers before bed, trusting that God and community together will hold the night at bay. For crime in the medieval village is not only an act against individuals, but against the fragile web of trust that binds all together. To steal, to wound, to betray, is to unravel the fabric of safety, to tear hit in the net that keeps hunger and fear at arm's length. That is why punishment will come, swift and visible, for justice must restore what crime has broken. But before punishment, there is always the shadow, the silence of night, the cry of alarm, the racing of hearts in the dark. Thus begins the story of crime and punishment. In shadows at the edge of the village, fear walks hand in hand with silence, and the fragile peace of the community waits for dawn. In a world without policemen, we know them. Law and order in the medieval village depended on the villagers themselves. Safety was not the task of strangers in uniform, but of neighbors bound together, each responsible for the other. The system was simple, but it carried great weight. The tithing. A tithing was a group of 10 households sworn to watch over one another. Every man above a certain age was bound by oath to keep the peace, to bring forward wrongdoers, and to answer if one among them broke the law. If a thief fled, his tithing was called upon to pursue him. If a murderer vanished, his fellows were charged with finding him. Guilt was never borne alone, it was shared by the group, ensuring that no man could vanish into anonymity. In this way, responsibility spread like threads in a net, binding each person to his neighbor, making the village itself a guardian of order. The oath was solemn. Gathered before the steward or reeve, men placed hands upon the book of the Gospels and swore to uphold the king peace, to accuse no innocent, and to conceal no guilty man. Breaking such said oath was more than crime, it was perjury, a stain upon the soul. For in medieval thought, justice was not only a human arrangement, but a sacred duty. To lie in court, to protect a wrongdoer, was to endanger one's own salvation. By day, the tithing work was quiet, watching, listening, noting quarrels that might flare into violence. By night, its vigilance grew sharper. When shadows thickened and strangers passed through, members of the tithing might walk the lanes, lanterns in end, staffs at their sides. If a cry of alarm went up, they were the first to respond, rousing neighbors, sounding the bell, chasing thieves across fields or into the woods. Their presence was a warning that crime, though possible, would not go unanswered. In towns and larger villages, a night watch was often kept. The watchman was a familiar figure, cloak wrapped tight against the chill, lantern swinging, staff in hand. He walked the streets slowly, pausing at crossroads, listening for trouble. Sometimes he called the hour aloud, his voice carrying through the darkness, past midnight and an as well. His words reassured sleepers, though to the weary watchman the hours stretched long and lonely. If he caught someone wandering suspiciously at night, he demanded explanation, Who goes there? What is your business? Strangers were held until morning, neighbors were warned to return home. The watchman was no knight, no soldier. He was a villager himself, often serving by rotation, his turn coming ye part of duty to the community. Some complained of the burden, longing for sleep instead of pacing the streets. Others bore it proudly, feeling the honor of keeping their fellows safe. Whatever their mood, the task was shared, for safety belonged to all. When a crime did occur, the alarm was swift, the cry of harrow, 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 horrow, out ad, or out, so the whole of the night, summoning every man to the chase. Doors flew open, villagers spilled into the dark with torches and clubs. The hue and cry, bellows, it was barred, was not optional. All who heard it were bound to join. To ignore it was itself a crime, for the peace was common, not private. The sight of villagers running together, lanterns bobbing, dogs barking at their heels, was enough to terrify many a thief into dropping his plunder and fleeing. The system was imperfect. A cunning outlaw would slip away into the woods, a strong thief might outrun the chase, an innocent man might be accused by enemies, yet the system worked more often than it failed, for its strength lay not in perfection, but in participation. All bore the weight of law together, and in that shared burden lay safety. The tithing was also a reminder of the closeness of medieval life. Privacy was scarce, secrets difficult to keep, neighbors knew one another, habits, quarrels, and needs. If a crime was committed, suspicion quickly fell, and whispers spread. The guilty might hide for a time, but the eyes of the tithing were many, and sooner or later truth surfaced. At the heart of it lay the bell, hung in churchyards or on wooden frames in village squares. Its rope was ready to be pulled in alarm. When its voice rang out at night, deep and insistent, all knew their duty. Men seized weapons, women guarded children, the village rose they'd won. The bell was more than metal, it was the voice of justice calling each person to act, binding all together in defense of peace. Thus, order in the medieval village was not imposed from above alone, but woven from within. The tithing and the watch turned neighbors into guardians, shared oaths into shields, and common duty into law. In their vigilance, the fragile peace of the village was preserved, day after day, night after night, through centuries of shadow and light. Beyond the tilled fields and the church bell reach lie the places where law grows thin, the forest, the heath, the lonely road that winds between villages. These are the haunts of bandits and outlaws, men cast from society or driven to crime, who live by the ambush and the blade. In every village, stories are told of them, sometimes whispered in fear, sometimes shouted in tavern boasts, always shadowed with unease. The outlaw is both real and imagined. Real in that many a merchant has returned home bruised and robbed, many a traveler has vanished on the road, his goods gone and his fate given. Imagined in that tales grow with each telling, bandits turned into demons of the forest, shadows that can never be caught. Yet whether truth or tale, the fear is the same, that the road ahead may be watched by hungry eyes. Forests, especially, carry this dread. Their trees rise tall, their shadows thick, their silence broken only by the crack of branches and the cry of distant beasts. A lone traveler stepping beneath those boughs feels the press of eyes unseen, the weight of possibility. Bandits know these woods well, their paths hidden, their hideouts secret. They strike swiftly, an arrow loosed from cover, a cry of command, men leaping from behind trunks with knives or clubs. Stand and yield your purse. The startled traveler, heart pounding, has little choice but to obey. Outlaws live hard lives. Cast from their tithing, stripped of protection, they are declared outside the law. Anyone may strike them down without fear of punishment, yet as survive, clinging to life in caves or huts deep in the wild. They hunt game, steal sheep from folds, raid travelers, and sometimes trade secretly with villagers too afraid or too greedy to refuse. For many, outlawry begins with desperation, a debt unpaid, a theft committed, a quarrel turned deadly. Once named outlaw, return is nearly impossible. To live beyond the law is to live at a ghost, hunted by sheriffs, shunned by kin, feared by all. Yet tales of outlaws are not always give. Around firelight, children listen, wide-eyed, to stories of clever rogues who rob the rich and spare the poor, who outwit sheriffs, who vanish into the greenwood laughing. Such stories comfort, for they turn fear into play, danger into marvel. In these tales, the outlaw becomes not only a threat, but a symbol of freedom, of resistance against harsh lords and heavy taxes. Whether such men truly existed or were shaped by longing, the stories endure, woven into song and legend. Merchants fear bandits most. With wagons laden with cloth, spices, or coin, they are tempting prey. Many travel in groups for safety, hiring guards or riding with caravans. Along certain roads, inns and watchtowers rise, placed there by lords eager to keep trade flowing. Yet even so, the danger cannot be wholly banished. A bend in the road, a stretch of forest, a sudden storm, any may have cover for attack. Merchants speak often of saints' protection, making offerings before journeys, carrying charms to ward off misfortune. Still, their eyes dart constantly to the shadows, wheels creak and horses plod. Bandits aye haunt bridges and fords. When rivers swell with rain, crossings become narrow and perilous. There on the far side, men may wait, demanding tolls not sanctioned by any lord. Refusal brings blows, compliance, poverty. The bridge itself becomes a trap, its timbers echoing with footsteps of fear. The punishment for banditry is harsh. Should a band be caught, their fate is swift. The gallows, the noose, the jeering crowd. Lords make examples of them, for nothing endangers peace more than lawlessness on the roads. Bodies may hang for days, crows circling overhead, their sight a warning to others. Yet still, U-bands rise, drawn by hunger, by greed, by the belief that luck may favor them where it failed their fellows. To ordinary villagers, the outlaw is both menace and mystery. They fear his thefts, yet secretly admire his defiance. They lock doors at night, yet whisper tales of greenwood kings. They pray for safety on the road, yet dream of freedom from lords and sheriffs. In the outlaw, they see both danger and desire, the shadow of crime and the glimmer of rebellion. As dusk falls, the village hearth seems warmer, the church bell steadied, when thoughts turn to the wild beyond. For out there, beyond the last furrow, lies the place where law is weak. Men live by knife and cunning. We a lone traveler may vanish without trace. Out there walk the outlaws and bandits, figures half real, half legend, forever haunting the edge of medieval imagination. If the church was the heart of devotion and the market the heart of trade, then the tavern was the heart of laughter and trouble. By day its doors stood open to weary laborers seeking bread and ale after toil. By night it glowed with lantern light, the sound of mugs clattering, dice rattling, voices rising in song or argument. Within its smoky walls, villagers found comfort and camaraderie, but also danger. For where ale flowed, tempers loosened, and quarrels too often turned to crime. Alehouses were simple places, timbered walls darkened with smoke, floors of beaten earth or rough boards, benches lined the walls, a heavy table stood at the center, mugs hung from pegs, and barrels waited in the corner. The smell of yeast and wood smoke clung to every beam. Women, often alewives, brewed the drink, their hands stained from stirring mash, their aprons damp with spills, for most ale was daily drink, safer than water, nourish a much at pleasure, but when too much was poured, its warmth turned to fire. Games were played, bitmugs were drained, dice clattered upon the table of men leaning close, eyes bright with hope or suspicion. A lucky throw might bring cheers, an unlucky one curses, a suspected cheat, a sudden blow. Cards were not yet common, but dice and boards sufficed to stir fortune and fury alike. Wagers were made not only in coin, but in goods, chicken, tools, even promises of labor. To lose was bitter, to win was sweet, but to suspect deceit was to ignite quarrel that could spill into the lane. Ale itself was cause for dispute. Was the mug full? Was the brew strong or weak? The measure honest or false? Alewives were sometimes accused of cheating, of adding too much water, of using false measures. The assize of ale proclaimed by crown and court set standards for strength and price, but enforcement was uneven. When villagers believed themselves cheated, tempers flared, words flew, and the steward might soon hear complaint. Yet many returned the next night, for where else would warmth and laughter be found? Violence was never far. A careless insult about land, about kin, about honor could spark a fight. Benches overturned, mugs smashed, fists flew, knives flashed too often, and wounds were common. The cry might rise, neighbors rushing in, dragging men apart, blood on floorboards, curses echoing in smoky air. The next day, bruised men stood before court, fined for brawling, their names recorded, their reputance stained. Yet week later they returned to the tavern once more, as though drawn back by the same fire that had burned them. The church frowned upon such disorder. Priests preached against dice and drunkenness, warning that alehouses led to sin. Bishops ordered inspections, demanding honest measures, forbidding gambling, urging restraint. Yet even priests were seen sometimes sipping ale in corners, for the warmth of fellowship was hard to resist. Taverns endured, for they met a need old at mankind, the need to gather, to laugh, to forget labor and sorrow for a time. For villages, the tavern was both joy and danger. Songs lifted spirits, tales lightened hearts, friendships were forged in shared mugs, yet beneath the laughter lurked quarrel, beneath the gain lay suspicion, beneath the warmth smoldered fire. Crime mere was not always planned, but born of drink, pride, and chance, and so the tavern stood, both beloved and feared, a place where law and disorder met beneath a low roof and the glow of a lantern. At night, when voices finally quieted, the last embers glowing in the hearth, the floor sticky with ale and blood, silence returned. But the memory of laughter, of quarrel, of dice and song lingered, carried into dreams. In the morning the tavern door opened again, the barrels tapped once more, and the cycle began anew. Not on crime came from the shadows of the forest or the blades of bandits. Often it rose from within the village itself. from quarrels that began small but swelled into anger, violence, and wounds that could not be hidden. For when men and women live close, sharing fields, water, fences, and taverns, tempers are easily kindled, and the line between argument and crime is thin. The causes were old the plough, a pig rooting in a neighbor garden, trampling beans or onions, a cow breaking through a weak fence and damaging a field, a cart left in the lane blocking passage. Such slights might seem small, but in a world where every sheaf of grain mattered, where survival hung on fragile harvests, they cut deep. Harsh words followed, then shouts, then sometimes fists or knives. What began the dispute over beasts or boundary could end with blood in the dust. Water, too, was cause for strife. Villagers quarreled over rights to draw from wells, to dam streams, to turn mill wheels. The mill, especially, owned often by lord or monastery, was a place of tension. A miller accused of taking more than his share of grain, of cheating by weight or measure, might face the fury of those he served. More than one miller found himself dragged into the lane, beaten by angry farmers who had endured too much. Taverns added their share of trouble. By day, they were places of ale and talk, of laughter after toil. By night, when mugs had been drained too often, they became breeding grounds of quarrel. Insults flew easily after drink, old grudges rekindled, pride stung, fists slammed against tables, benches overturned, mugs shattered on the floor. A brawl might spill into the lane, neighbors dragged in whether willing or not. A zine wound from knife or club could turn merriment into mourning, laughter into crime. Words themselves were weapons. Slander and insult carried weight, for honor was precious and reputation fragile. To call a man a thief, a woman unchaste, a neighbor dishonest, was to wound deeply, sometimes more than blows. Disputes over words often came before courts, for speech could tear a village apart. Teach surely thee violence. To accuse falsely was itself a crime, but to endure insult without answer was unbearable. Thus quarrels flared, sharpened by pride, inflamed by gossip, spreading through the lanes like fire through thatch. When brawls broke out, the village stirred quickly. The cry went up, neighbors rushed, torches flared. Some tried to pull fighters apart, others cheered them on, children darting close to see. Yet all knew that what happened in the heat of anger would end in the lane alone. Injuries meant questions, questions meant court, and court meant punishment. The steward or reeve would hear of it, fines would be levied, and those who had fought would pay in coin or labor for the peace they had broken. Yet disputes ended with punishment. Some were settled by mediation, elders stepping in to calm tempers, priests urging forgiveness, neighbors reminding one another of the bonds they shared. A handshake before the altar, a promise made on oath, might restore harmony. Fines would be paid, wounds healed, friendships mended. For in the village no one lived apart, enemies were also neighbors, and grudges could not be sustained without harming all. Still, the memory of quarrels lingered. Old insults were not forgotten, old wounds not easily forgiven. The man who once raised a knife in anger might be watched with suspicion for years. The woman accused of slander might find her words weighed more harshly. Crime in the village was not only punished by court but by memory, by the whispers that followed long after the steward fine was paid. At night, when villagers led by hearths, stories of the day quarrels were told again and then. Children listened, learning who had fought, who had spoken harshly, who had made peace. In this way, the history of disputes became part of the village story, woven into its memory bay tightly day harvests and feasts. Thus crime was not always the act of strangers or shadows. Often it was born in the ordinary life of the village, in fields, in taverns, in words spoken too sharply. It rose from hunger, from pride, from the closeness of lives bound together. Though courts and fines might restore the balance, the memory of quarrels remained, a reminder that peace was fragile, that crime could begin with nothing more than a pig in the beans, a mug of ale too may, or a word too harshly spoken. When quarrels grew too sharp, when theft was discovered, when wounds were left in the dust of the lane, the village turned to the Manor Court. It was he, beneath the eye of the Lord Steward, that justice was measured and peace restored, not always perfectly, but visibly, so that all might know the law still held sway. The Manor Court was no lofty hall of marble and robed judges. It was often held in a barn, a church porch, or beneath the spreading branches of a great tree. Villagers sat on benches or stood in a circle, their breath misting in the morning air, their voices hushed as they waited. The steward sat at a tave, a clerk beside him with parchment and quill, ready to record the day matters. A staff of office, a seal, or the Lord banner might be displayed, reminders that this was not merely talk, but the business of law. Attendance was not optional. Each household owed suit to the court, bound to appear when summoned, to serve as jurors, to bear witness, to hear judgments. Even those with no quarrel of their own were drawn in, for the law was communal, not private. A villager absent without cause might himself be fined, his name entered in the rolls with the mark of neglect. The court was the village in microcosm, its order made visible. Cases varied in weight. The simplest were of small thefts, a chicken missing, an apple tree stripped, a scythe borrowed and not returned. The accused stood before the steward, head bowed, neighbors whispering in the crowd. If guilt was clear, a fine was levied, perhaps a few pennies, perhaps more if the theft was brazen. The money went to the Lord coffers, but the true purpose was the restoration of order, the public reminder that theft would not be ignored. Quarrel and brawls came often. Two men accused each other of assault, each nursing bruises, each insisting he was provoked. Witnesses were hauled, neighbors questioned, the steward listening with stern patience. At last he pronounced judgment, fines to both, perhaps heavier to the one found more at fault. If blood had been spilled, the fine rose higher, for the king peace had been broken. All present nodded, for though neither man was satisfied, both knew the matter was now closed, or at least bound by law. De listed strand op both nice, and filed hoofd broken, a one hand moved, a furrow plowed too wide, a path blocked. Such cases would drag on, with witnesses summoned, charters brought forth, oaths sworn upon holy books. The steward weighed all, his clerk scratching down each word. The judgment once made was binding, and to defy it was perilous, for the Lord Court was no mere council of neighbors, but a link in the chain of royal justice. The court also served as memory. It recorded not only crimes, but customs, who owed service on which days, who held which strips of land, who had the right to graze sheep on the common. In its rolls were written the life of the village, binding past to present. To lose a case was not only to pay a fine, but to alter the rut itself, a scar written into parchment that might endure for generations. Oaths were central. The accused might swear innocence, hand upon the Gospels, voice steady before God and neighbors alike. If his reputation was strong, if his tithing supported him, the oath might suffice. But if doubt lingered, the steward could demand compurgation, others swearing to his honesty, pledging their own souls upon his truth. To fail in such said oath, to be found lying, was ruinous, for perjury endangered not only reputation but salvation. Few dared risk it, and so oaths carried weight beyond coin. Punishments in the Manor Court were often fines, sometimes duties of labor or loss of property. Prison was rare, for cells were scarce and costly. The aim was not long confinement, but quick correction, a restoration of balance through payment, service, or shame. Yet the threat of harsher judgment loomed always, for raid crimes, murder, arson, repeated theft might be sent upward to the sheriff and the king justices, where gallows and dungeons awaited. The crowd itself was part of the court power. Neighbors watched, seized, names were read, fines were pronounced, and oaths were sworn. Their presence gave weight, for justice seen was justice believed. Children clutched their mothers' hands, learning through fear what words could not teach, that law was real, that crime had consequence, that order bound them. When the business was done, the steward dismissed the court with formal words. Villagers drifted away, grumbling, unrelieved, outsassened. The clerk rolled up the parchment, the steward packed his seals, and the tree or bar returned to silence. Yet the memory lingered, the thief bowed head, the quarreller's bruises, the steward's stern voice. Thus the Manor Court stood the everyday face of justice, neither lofty nor distant, but woven into village life, visible, audible, unforgettable. It was here that crime was named, punishment given, peace restored, and the fragile fabric of community mended. And though its judgments were simple, they echoed long, shaping memory, reputation, and the rhythm of law in the medieval world. Beyond the Manor Court, vines and oaths sufficed to mend quarrels and punish petty thefts. There stood a sterner arm of authority, the King Justice. When crimes were too vive, too violent, or too disruptive for the village to contain, the matter passed upward into the hands of sheriffs, justices, and royal officials. Their coming was rare, but when it occurred, it left a mark upon memory, for it was the presence of the crown itself descending upon village life. The sheriff was the king-man in the shire, a figure of weight and dread. He rode with armed men, his cloak bearing the mark of office, his seal granting power. Villagers paused and stared when his party entered a town, hooves striking sparks upon stone, banners fluttering. He brought with him the authority of the monarch, distant yet palpable, a reminder that beyond lord and steward stood a greater law, the king peace binding all. His duties were many. He levied taxes and rents, summoned men for military service, carried out writs from the royal chancery, but most feared was his role in law. He hunted fugitives, seized accused men, and brought them before higher courts. When gallows were raised, it was often under his command, his men standing guard, justice was carried out. To hear that the sheriff was coming was to know that mercy would be scarce, for his task was not to soothe but to enforce. Royal justices, too, traveled the land, holding assizes in market towns. These were great occasions, their arrival rocked by ceremony. Crowds thawed in squares, villagers craned to see, merchants pressed close, Children stared in awe. Beneath canopies or within guild halls, the justices sat, robes heavy, seals displayed. Clerks unrolled long parchments filled with names and cases, the ink dark against vellum. The business of law, once local and familiar, now stretched to encompass many villages, many crimes, all weighed beneath the king's gaze. At such sessions, grave crimes were heard: murder, arson, robbery, treason. The accused were wrought in chains, guarded by armed men. Witnesses stepped forward, voices trembling liens they spoke. Juries of villagers gave verdicts, swearing upon their souls. The justices listened, stern and remote, their judgments final. Punishments here were not small fines, but death, mutilation, or long imprisonment. The gallows outside the town stood ready, its beams stark against the sky. For villagers unaccustomed to such severity, the sight was unforgettable. A thief who in Manor Court might have paid pennies here, might lose his hand. A murderer faced hanging without hope of pardon. The crowd watched in silent stays. Ropes were tied. The condemned confessed sins. Priests murmured prayers. The sheriff gave the signal. The trap fell. The body swung. Justice, harsh in public, was done. Children clung to their mothers. Men removed their caps. Women crossed themselves. None forgot. Yet even if mercy sometimes intervened, the king might grant pardon, often at the request of a lord, a bishop, or for payment of heavy sums. To receive such mercy was rare, but when it came, it was celebrated de miracle. The condemned, released, walked among neighbors once more, a living reminder of both severity and grace. The sheriff reach extended even into daily life. His men hunted outlaws, riding into forests, setting traps along roads. They pursued fugitives across shires, their writs granting them authority wherever they went. To harbor such a man was perilous, for the sheriff's wrath fell heavily on those who defied him. Yet the villagers, out of kinship or pity, dared to aid the hunted, hiding them in barns, feeding them in secret, knowing full well the danger. The presence of the King Justice brought awe, fear, and sometimes resentment. For while villagers trusted their own courts to know them, to weigh their quarrels with their sense of custom and mercy, the royal officials were outsiders. They came with parchments and proclamants, unfamiliar with local disputes, more concerned with the letter of law than the bonds of neighborly life. Their justice was swift and harsh, leaving little room for compromise. Yet it was necessary, for without it the most violent crimes might fester unchecked. When the justices departed, when the sheriff men rode away, a hush often lingered. Villagers returned to fields and hearths, shaken by what they had seen. The gallows might remain standing, gid reminder of authority. The memory of trials and punishments remained vivid, shaping behavior for years. Parents warned children, mind your temper, mind your tongue, for the King Justice sees all. Thus the sheriff and the king justices stood as the long arm of power, stretching from distant castles and courts into the smallest villages. They brought fear, awe, and sometimes hope, reminding all that the law was not only local custom but royal command, not only the word of steward or priest, but the authority of crown and kingdom. In their presence, crime seemed heavy, punishment inevitable, and the weight of order undeniable. In the medieval world, words carried a weight almost as heavy as iron chains. For in a society wheat's written records were scarce and witnesses often few, the spoken oath stood at the heart of justice. To swear was not merely to promise, It was to bind one's soul before God, to stake salvation upon truth. And when guilt or innocence hung in the balance, oaths became the thread from which verdicts were woven. When a man stood accused before the Manor Court or the King Justices, he might be asked to wage his law to clear himself by oath. He would place his hand upon the Gospels or the relics of a saint, his fingers trembling slightly, his eyes lowered. The clerk recited the solemn words, and the accused repeated them, swearing that he was innocent of the charge, that he had spoken no falsehood, that God himself was witness to his truth. To rake such said oath was perjury, and perjury was no small crime. It endangered not only earthly reputation, but eternal soul. Yet rarely was a single oath enough to support his claim. The accused might need to gather compurgators, neighbors, or kin willing to swear alongside him. These men, often 12 in number, stood beside the accused, hands raised, voices steady, swearing not that they knew him innocent, but that they believed his oath was true. Their honor was pledged with his, their souls risked with his fate. For a man of good standing, respected in his tithing, compurgators came readily. But for one distrusted or shunned, few would step forward, and without them his case collapsed. Thus reputation became valuable coin, to live honestly, to treat neighbors fairly, to be known trustworthy. These were not only virtues, but safeguards against future peril. A man known for quarreling, thieving, or slandering might find himself unable to muster oaths when he most needed them, abandoned by neighbors unwilling to risk their own salvation for his sake. In this way, the law was not only enforced in courts, but in daily life, in the fragile weave of honor and trust. Witnesses too swore oaths, their testimony bound by sacred words. To lie was perilous, for if discovered, the liar faced not only earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. Yet temptation remained, and disputes sometimes devolved into contests of credibility, each side marshalling oaths to outweigh the other. The steward or justice weighed the balance, but always it was the oath itself that stood as the final thread of truth. Even lords and sheriffs respected the sanctity of oaths. A captured thief might beg to be tried not by ordeal or rope, but by his sworn word, if he could find compurgators to stand with him. Sometimes villages themselves swore oaths, declaring that no crime had been committed within their bounds, or that a fugitive had not been harbored. The collective word of the community was powerful, a shield against suspicion, though dangerous if false, for should the lie be discovered, punishment would fall upon all. The ritual of swearing was solemn. The church was often the stage, candles lit, relics displayed, the gospel book laid open. The accused touched holy objects, sometimes kissed them, though sealing his words with reverence. Priests stood by, reminding all that God's eye pierced every deceit, that no lie could escape judgment. To swear falsely was to risk not only gallows but damnation, and the fear of eternal fire kept many tongues truthful. Yet wrought trusted oaths alone. Some muttered that men of silver tongue might persuade compurgators, or that neighbors might swear out of kinship rather than truth. So when doubt lingered, harsher tests were invoked, ordeals of iron and water, that God was asked to reveal guilt directly. These were feared, for their outcome was terrible, but they reflected the same belief that truth could not be hidden from heaven, that God himself was the final judge. Still, for most disputes, oaths sufficed. They were practical, swift, and deeply feared. Villagers remembered who had sworn well, who had faltered, whose voice had trembled, whose reputation had carried weight. They learned that justice was not only in courts but in daily conduct, in how they were known and trusted. In this way, the oath bound not only the present case, but the fabric of community, weaving honesty, reputation, and law into one. At night, when villagers vethed by hearths, they spoke of the day trials. He swore well, one might say, nodding at a neighbor acquitted man would doubt him, or he found few to stand with him, his life of quarreling has cost him dear. Children listened, learning the lesson, live honestly, guard your reputation, for one day your life may hang on the words you speak before God. Thus, trials and oaths were more than rituals of law, they were acts of faith, moments when the unseen judge was wrought upon to witness truth. They shaped daily life, kept reputation bright, punished deceit, and reminded all that in every word, every promise, every dispute, heaven listened. Though fines and punishments might be given by stewards and sheriffs, it was the oath, the trembling hand upon the holy book, that carried the heaviest weight of all. When oaths were not enough, when suspicion lingered and truth seemed clouded by deceit, medieval justice turned to harsher proof. It was not enough to weigh words, God himself must be asked to judge. Thus arose the ordeal, fearful and solemn, where fire and water became instruments of truth, and the fate of souls was placed directly into divine hands. The ordeal began in ritual. The church was its stage, for this was no mere test of strength, but a plea to heaven. The accused fasted beforehand, confessing sins, receiving the Eucharist, purifying body and soul, so that God's judgment might be revealed without hindrance. Priests prayed solemnly, chanting psalms, sprinkling holy water upon tools and witnesses alike, for it was believed that heaven would not fail the innocent nor shield the guilty, and so the ordeal was sanctified, a sacred trial. And there were several forms, each terrible in its own way. The ordeal of hot iron was among the most feared. A bar of iron was placed upon the coals until it glowed red, its heat shimmering in the dim church. The accused stepped forward, hands trembling, sweat upon his brow. Before witnesses and priest, he lifted the iron and carried it 3 measured paces. The smell of burning flesh filled the air, the silence broken only by his gasps. Then the iron was laid down, his hand bound in linen, sealed with the sign of the cross. 3 days later, the wound was unwrapped. If it was healing clean, the verdict was innocence. If it festered or blackened, guilt was declared and punishment fell. The ordeal of boiling water was no gentian. A cauldron was set upon fire, filled until it bubbled and hissed. A stone or ring was cast within, sinking to the depths. The accused, stripped to the waist, plunged his arm in and drew it out. The burn was wrapped, sealed, and judged is in the ordeal of iron. For the innocent, it was said, God would protect from harm, for the guilty, the wound would betray. The ordeal of cold water reversed the logic. The accused was bound with cords and lowered into a pool or river. Priests praying aloud at the crowd leaned forward. If the water received him, drawing him beneath, it was seen then, sign of innocence, water, pure and blessed, embracing the guiltless. If he floated, refusing to sink, the water rejected him, marking him guilty. Few forgot the sight of a bound man floundering in the stream, his fate judged not by words but by waves. Women sometimes faced ordeals of a different kind. In cases of suspicion, of theft, of sorcery, of adultery, they might be forced to carry red-hot irons or to walk barefoot across glowing plowshares. Some endured their burns light or quickly healed, taken deep proof of innocence. Others faltered, their wounds severe, their guilt proclaimed. The community watched with wide eyes, whispering of divine will, their hearts stirred by awe and fear. Always the ordeal was public, crowds the pressing close, silent in the solemn of it. Children clutched their mothers' hands, men crossed themselves, wind whispered prayers. The priest's chant echoed in the vaulted church or across the open yard, mingling with the hiss of steam, the crackle of fire, the rush of water. All felt the weight of the moment, for rare was no steward judgment, no sheriff writ, but God decision made visible. To modern eyes, the ordeal seems cruel, but to the medieval heart it was a kind of mercy, for it placed justice beyond human frailty, beyond deceitful tongues and biased neighbors. If the accused was guilty, God would show it. If innocent, God would shield. Faith made sense of pain, giving wounds meaning, turning burns and bruises into signs of divine truth. Yet ordeals were feared deeply. To be summoned to one was terror enough, for even the innocent dreaded the trial. Men prayed with fervor, wind wept, families fasted, begging heaven for mercy. Some fled rather than face the test, embracing outlawry rather than ordeal. Others resigned themselves, stepping forward with grim courage, their trust placed wholly in God's hand. In time, the church itself began to question. Could one truly bind God to reveal guilt through such means, or men presuming too much upon divine will? By the 13th century, many ordeals faded, replaced by juries and testimony. But for centuries before, the ordeal remained, its memory etched in scar and story. Villages told of men who carried red iron unscathed, women who plunged arms into boiling cauldrons and emerged unmarked, men who sank stones to prove their innocence. At night, when candles burned low, such tales were told by hearths, children listening wide-eyed, imagining the hiss of water, the glow of iron. They learned that crime and innocence were not only matters of man judgment, but of God, that the sacred and the terrifying walked hand in hand in the pursuit of justice. Thus the ordeal was both horror and hope, a trial of body and soul. Pain itself became evidence, which wounds spoke in place of words, and that all who watched believed they glimpsed heaven hand reaching down into the affairs of men. In the chronicles of crime, men are most often named thieves, bandits, brawlers, murderers. Yet when two stood accused, their lives no less bound by law and punishment. Their crimes were often different, shaped by roles and expectations, but the weight of judgment fell heavily upon them all the same. The most common charge was scolding, women who quarreled too fiercely, who shouted insults in lanes, who spread gossip sharp enough to wound reputation, were branded common scolds. Their voices, it was said, disrupted the peace of village life. Men might brawl with fists or knives, but weapons were words, and those words were feared for their power to stir discord. The punishment was humiliation, the cucking stool or the ducking stool. The cucking stool was a wooden chair, sometimes mounted on wheels, sometimes balanced on a long beam over water. The condemned woman was tied fast, her skirts tucked, her hair flying. She was paraded through the village, jeered by crowds. At the river edge, the stool was tilted, plunging her into the cold water, dragging her sputtering to the surface, only to be dunked again. Laughter rang, insults flew, children shouted gleefully. The scold, dripping and shivering, endured until the crowd was satisfied. Shame was her punishment, water her scours, silence her expected lesson. Women all face charges of slander. To accuse a neighbor of theft, adultery, or dishonesty without proof was crime, well-led sin. Before the Manor Court, women stood with heads bowed, their words weighed, their reputation questioned. Fines might be levied, but more often shame was imposed. Hair cut short, a hood of shame placed upon the head, or public confession demanded before altar and parish. For a woman, reputation was fragile, and slander not only wounded others but endangered her own standing in community. Petty theft, too, was common. A loaf of bread taken from a stall, a hen slipped from a coop, a bolt of cloth hidden beneath skirts. Hunger drove men such acts, for women often bore the weight of feeding families when food was scarce, yet courts judged sternly, for theft, however small, threatened survival of. Women caught were fined, set in stocks, or whipped, their shame public, their desperation rarely excused. More fearful still were charges of witchcraft. Though not yet the frenzied hunts of later centuries, suspicion lingered. A cow sickened, a child failed to thrive, a storm ruined crops, whispers rose of a woman curse. Old widows, healers with herbs, midwives who knew too much of birth and death, these were most vulnerable. They were hauled before courts, pressed to confess, forced to endure ordeals. Some were acquitted, fined, punished with harsher fates. Fear clung to them long after, for once named a witch, suspicion never faded. Adultery, too, was judged more harshly upon women than men. A wife accused of straying faced public shame, sometimes paraded through streets in mocking garb, sometimes forced to stand before altar and confess. Men's sins were excused aid folly, women condemned betrayal. Such double standards lay heavy upon them, their lives bound by law more tightly, their honor more fragile. Yet would oft defended themselves with strength. Many scolds shouted back, even e'en they were ducked, refusing silence. Some fought fines, bringing witnesses, swearing innocence with oaths, binding means any man. Some turned accusations back upon their accusers, exposing hypocrisy. And many endured, their reputation mended in time, their voices never wholly silenced. For the community, crimes of woman carried unease. To punish too harshly risked cruelty, to punish too lightly risked disorder. Gossip and slander spread quickly, shaping judgment before courts spoke. Children watched deed, women were ducked or shamed, learning lessons of speech and silence, of gender and power. The sight of a dripping figure hauled from water, hair plastered, eyes flashing with anger or despair, lingered long in memory. At night, in cottages, wind whispered of such things, warning daughters to guard tongues, to keep peace, to avoid suspicion. Men, too, reflected uneasily, for they knew their own mothers, wives, and daughters might one day face the same. The line between ordinary quarrel and crime was thin, and the weight of law heavy upon those who crossed it. Thus, when crimes and punishments reveal both the strictness and the fragility of medieval law, they show how community feared not only theft or violence, but words, reputation, and the mysterious powers of the body. They remind us that justice was not equal, that women bore shame differently, that law mirrored the prejudices of its age. Yet they also reveal resilience, the strength of women who endured, who resisted, who survived the ducking stool, the stocks, the court judgment, and returned to live, work, and speak again. Not every crime ended with iron or gallows. Many were punished instead by shame public, visible, unforgettable. For in the medieval village, reputation was life itself, and to be mocked, jeered, and humiliated before one's neighbors was a wound, painful lays any lash. Thus the stocks, the pillory, and other engines of disgrace stood ready, waiting at the edge of squares and market greens, their wooden beams weather-rare by sun and rain, their locks polished by ease. The stocks were simple but effective, a heavy frame of wood set low to the ground with wood for ankles. The offender was seated or forced to lie, legs clamped fast, unable to move. Sometimes hands were locked at well, leaving him helpless. He might remain there for hours, even days, exposed to sun, rain, and the mockery of all who passed. Children jeered, tossing mud or rotten vegetables. Women wagged fingers, men spat or shouted insults. Laughter echoed, cruel and cutting, while the prisoner would only endure, face reddening with shame. The pillory was harsher still. It stood upright, a wooden frame with hoods for head and hands. The condemned was lacked in place, body bent forward, unable to move arms or wipe his face. All who passed saw him, for the pillory was placed in the busiest spot of town near the market, beside the church, at the center of the green. There the punishment was not only confinement but exposure, a spectacle meant to teach. Villagers laughed, mocked, threw filth, pelted with eggs, dung, or stones. The body bore bruises, the spirit bore humiliation, the name bore stain that lingered long. Such punishments were given for lesser crimes: petty theft, cheating in trade, slander, drunkenness, disorder. They were not meant to kill, but to correct, to deter. The memory of the pillory, of standing helpless while neighbors mocked, was lesson enough for many never to offend again, and for the community the sight gave reassurance. The law was visible, the guilty unmasked, justice done for all to see. Other shames were used date well. A woman guilty of scolding or slander might be set upon the cucking stool, tied fast and ducked into water until she gasped and sputtered, the crowd roaring with laughter. Her dripping figure, dragged out and jeered, was warning to all who spoke too freely. Drunkards might be forced to wear ridiculous masks or horns, paraded through streets to mock their folly. Bakers who sold light bread were nailed by the ear to their own doors. The crooked loaf hung about their neck, its sign of deceit. The punishments were theater and by the law. They turned crime into lesson, guilt into laughter, suffering into entertainment. Markets paused, villagers feathered, ale flowing, children wide-eyed, gossip rising. Some felt pity, others relish, but all watched, for none could resist the spectacle of humiliation. Yet beneath the jeers lay seriousness. To be mocked was not only momentary pain but lasting scar. Reputation once sullied was hard to mend. A man who had stood in stocks might find neighbors less willing to trade, less eager to trust his word in court, less ready to stand ens compurgator. A woman ducked for slander might find her voice forever dismissed, her gossip distrusted even when true. Public shame followed long after the stocks were emptied, echoing in whispers and glances. Still there was room for redemption. Some endured with stoic calm, head held high, refusing to flinch or cry. Neighbors, seeing such strength, sometimes softened, pity rising. A priest might visit, offering prayer, reminding all of forgiveness. In time, a life of honesty and service could mend what shame had broken. Yet the memory of the pillory remained, carved into the imagination, a warning both to the guilty and to all who watched. The place itself carried weight to pass by empty stocks, was to remember those who had sat there, their faces vivid in memory. To see the pillory standing silent was to feel its threat, as if it waited patiently for the next sinner. Even when unused, these devices spoke, their wooden beams heavy with the weight of past disgrace. At night, when the crowd dispersed, the punished released, the square grew silent once more. Yet scraps of food, broken eggs, and muddy footprints lingered, silent testimony of the day, laughter, and cruelty. The wooden frames loomed in moonlight, shadows stretched across cobblestones, reminders that law was not only about order, but about spectacle, not only about crime, but about shame. Thus, stocks and pillories served the common face of justice, binding community together through laughter and lesson, through cruelty and correction. They made guilt visible, suffering shared, order restored, not by secrecy, but by spectacle. And in their beams of weather-air wood, villagers saw both fear and reassurance, fear that they themselves might one day stand there, reassurance that the law remained strong, guarding the fragile peace of daily life. If shame alone would not deter, the medieval world turned to the body itself. Flesh bore the mark of justice, pain carried the memory of crime, and scars stood as lifelong warnings. Corporate punishment was brutal, but it was swift, and in its swiftness lay its purpose, to strike fear into others, to remind all that crime carried weight not only in coin or reputation, but in the very flesh of the offender. The most common was the lash. A thief might be stripped to the waist, tied fast to a post, his arms stretched wide, the whip cracked through the air, its leather cords biting into skin. With each strike, welts rose, blood sometimes flowing, cries echoing against stone or timber. The crowd then, giz or eager, unwatching with pity, others with cruel delight. The number of lashes was set by court or steward 10, 20, perhaps more. When it ended, the man staggered away, back rocked with pain, spirit rocked with shame, a living warning to all. Branding was harsher still. For repeated thefts or deceit, the hand might be burned with hot iron, leaving a scar that rocked the crime forever. The letter T for thief, sometimes, or a symbol chosen by the court. The iron was heated until it glowed, the smell of burning flesh filling the air as it touched skin. The crowd murmured, some crossing themselves, others turning away. The branded hand betrayed guilt forever after, a stigma impossible to hide. No oath could carry the same weight beneath that scar, no protest of innocence erase its mark. Mutilation was the sternest of a vet. A pickpocket might lose his fingers, a slanderer her tongue, a false accuser his ears. The knife fell swift, the wound bandaged roughly, the punishment permanent. Few dared repeat crime after such loss, for the body itself bore witness. And for the community, the sight was unforgettable, an earless face, a tongue-lin mouth, a hand missing its fingers. Justice had not only punished but transformed, turning the criminal into a walking sign of law. The punishments were not given lightly, for they were irreversible. They were reserved for the stubbornly guilty, the repeatedly offending, or the gravely criminal. Yet when imposed, they carried a weight beyond any fine or oath. The body did not forget, the community did not forget, and the memory of pain and scar lived on long after parchment rolls faded. Publicness was key. The lash was delivered before a watching crowd, the branding iron pressed while neighbors stood nearby, the mutilation done with all theirs to see, for punishment was lesson, and lesson required audience. Children peered from behind skirts, men muttered giddily, women whispered prayers, some watched with satisfaction, seeing justice done, others with sorrow, pitying even the guilty, but all watched, and in watching learned. Yet beneath the severity there lingered unease. Priests warned against cruelty, reminding on that even sinners were souls, that mercy should temper wrath. Some punishments shocked even those accustomed to harshness, leaving scars not only on the punished, but on the hearts of those who witnessed. And so, alongside pain, there was always prayer, prayer that the sinner might repent, that God mercy might heal what man justice had broken. Corporate punishment carried all the mark of authority. To see the steward order lashes, the sheriff command branding, the king justice decree, mutilation, was to feel the weight of law. The body of the guilty became the parchment upon which power was written, a living proclamation that the lord or crown ruled not only through coin or word, but through command over flesh itself. At night, when the square emptied and the punished lay nursing wounds, silence fell heavy. The post stood empty, the iron cooling, the knife cleaned and set aside. Yet the memory lingered, the cries, the scars, the smell of fire. In cottages, villagers spoke softly of what they had seen, warning children, shaking heads, reminding one another of the cost of sin. Sleep came slowly, dreams troubled by visions of lash and brand. Thus corporate punishment was both fear and lesson, cruelty and correction. It struck deep into body and spirit, leaving marks that lasted lifetimes. Though harsh, it was believed necessary, for without such severity, law might falter, crime might spread, and peace so fragile might rake. In scars and screams, the medieval village read the message clear. Justice was not gentle, but it was present, and its hand reached even into the very flesh of its people. All punishments, shame, lash, branding were severe, but none carried the final death. Execution was the last and greatest sanction, reserved for the gravest crimes, murder, treason, arson, repeated theft, rebellion. To face the gallows or the axe was to stand not only before the judgment of man, but on the very threshold of eternity. And for the medieval mind, death in punishment was both terror and spectacle, a moment where justice and salvation collided before the eyes of all. The gallows stood often on a hill outside the village or town, stark against the sky, visible from fields and roads. Its beams were dark with weather and age, sometimes with older stains. To see, it was to be reminded daily of the law reach, its wood, a silent warning to all who passed. Children pointed at it, asking questions in hushed tones. Farmers looked toward it when leaving fields at dusk, crossing themselves with unease. When the day of execution came, the crowd gathered early. Market stalls closed, work paused, villagers streamed toward the gallows. Merchants and strangers mingled with peasants and lords, for all were drawn to the spectacle. The condemned was led forth under guard, hands bound, often barefoot, sometimes in a plain shift. A priest walked beside him, murmuring prayers, urging confession, holding a crucifix high, Bells tolled slowly, their sound carrying across the countryside, solemn and heavy. For the condemned, the final walk was burdened with ritual. He might confess aloud, naming sins, asking forgiveness from God and neighbors alike. He might proclaim innocence, though such cries rarely changed his fate. Some went silently, heads bowed, others shouted defiance, cursing their judges, their fate, the crowd itself. The mood varied, but all knew the end was certain. At the gallows, the executioner waited, hooded or barefaced. He was both feared and necessary, a man rocked by his trade. The rope swung in the breeze, coarse and unforgiving. The condemned mounted the ladder or stood upon the cart, priest whispering final prayers. The crowd hushed, breath held, hearts tight. Then the rope was fixed, the signal given, the cart drawn away or the ladder kicked aside. The body dropped, the rope snapped taut, and death came slowly, cruelly. Legs kicked, arms strained, faces contorted. Some died swiftly, others lingered, and the crowd watched in silence, murmuring prayers or gasping at the sight. Hanging was the common fate, but other deaths carried their own horrors. Beheading, reserved for nobles, was quicker, though not always clean. The axe or sword fell, sometimes true, sometimes clumsy, forcing repeated blows. Burning at the stake was punishment for heresy. The flames consuming body and voice together mid smoke rose to heaven. Drowning or burying alive were whispered of in darker tales. Punishments for women condemned of witchcraft or child murder. Each method was chosen with purpose, each designed not only to kill but to teach. The body was not always released to family. Sometimes it was left upon the gallows, swinging in the wind, crows gathering, flesh wasting, bones whitening in the sun. Passers saw it daily, a give reminder. There hangs the thief, they said, pointing to the empty sockets, the skeletal grin. Fear was kept alive not only in memory but in sight. In other cases, bodies were cut down after a time, buried in unconsecrated ground, denied the rest of churchyard soil. To die by rope was not only to lose life, but to lose honor, burial, and peace. For the crowd, the execution was both horror and reassurance. Horror at the suffering, the cries, the twisting body, reassurance that justice lived, that the peace of the village was defended, that crime bore its cost. Children were warned by parents, remember what you saw, and walk the path of law. Men muttered of fairness or cruelty, wind whispered prayers for mercy, priests reminded all of sin, penance, and salvation. For the condemned, hope lingered even in the final moment. If confession was made, if priestly absolution given, the soul might yet be saved, though the body perished. Many clung to this, confessing at the last, kissing the crucifix, whispering prayers. The rope tightened. In the medieval mind, death was punishment but also passage, and to die shriven was a mercy, even on the gallows. When the crowd dispersed, silence returned to the hill. The wind stirred the rope, crows circled, shadows lengthened. Villagers walked home more slowly, speaking in hushed tones, their own lives measured against what they had seen. In cottages that night, candles burned lower, prayers longer, sleep troubled by images of swinging rope and final cries. Thus execution stood the ultimate edge of justice. Crime was ended by death. The body and soul parted under the eye of law and God. It was terror, warning, ritual, and lesson all in one, binding community together in the shared witness of justice carried out. Though the gallows wood might rot, though the rope might fray, its memory endured in every villager heart. Crime led dead, and beyond this fight there was no return. Though the gallows and the lash were swift, there were times when justice demanded not death nor blows, but confinement. To be locked away, cut off from fields and family, from light and air, was itself a punishment, a slower, quieter form of suffering. In the medieval world, prisons were not yet the vast institutions of later centuries, but they existed in many forms. Dank cells beneath castles, stone towers above city gates, chambers in town halls, even sheds or barns pressed into service. They were places of waiting, of fear, of despair. For most, prison was not a sentence in itself, but a holding place. The accused, once seized by sheriff or steward, was confined until trial. The guilty, once condemned, might be held until execution. But ere were sentenced to long confinement, their crime deemed too vain for fine, yet not deserving of death. For such men and women, the days stretched endlessly, rocked only by the rattle of chains and the faint light filtering through barred slits. Castle dungeons were most feared. Beneath thick walls and heavy towers, narrow stairways led downward into darkness. The air grew damp, the smell rank with mold and waste. Cells were small, sometimes little more than huts carved in stone, with straw for bedding, a bucket for need, iron rings set into walls. Chains clinked and prisoners shifted, their ankles rubbed raw, wrists bruised from manacles. Rats scurried in corners, water dripped steadily, echoing in the gloom. To spend winks here was misery, to spend years was torment beyond imagining. Not on prisons were so give. In towns, chambers above gatehouses or within halls might serve as cells. These were brighter, with windows overlooking streets, and prisoners could sometimes see life continuing beyond their bars, markets bustling, children laying, bells ringing. This sight was its own torment, freedom so close, yet unreachable. Sometimes families passed food through the bars, or friends sought encouragement from below. But always the iron lock, the guard-watchful eye, reminded the prisoner of his cage. Life in confinement was harsh, food was coarse, stale bread, thin broth, water drawn from wells, straw grew foul quickly, vermin infested corners, cold bit deep in winter, heat stifled in summer. Guards varied, yet cruel, mocking, quick with staff or boot, others indifferent, doing only their duty. For the prisoner, time blurred, days merging into one another, broken only by bells from churches outside or the occasional visit of priest or kin. Yet within prison walls, hope still stirred. Priests came to hear confession, to off the host, to remind prisoners that even chains could not bind the soul. Families brought bread, candles, clothing, small comforts. Some prisoners carved crosses into stone, marks of days or prayers whispered, songs echoed softly, hymns rising faintly in the dark. Faith clung to the last possession. Escape was rare, but dreamed of always. Stories were told of men filing through bars with smuggled tools, of women bribing guards with coins or favors, of ropes lowered from windows by friends outside. Some succeeded, vanishing into forest or town, living thereafter as fugitives. Others failed, caught and punished with harsher chains or with the rope itself. Imprisonment carried shame but suffering, to be known as one who had lain in chains, who had eaten prison bread, rocked a man reputation. Neighbors whispered, children pointed, trust faltered. Even after release, the memory clung like shadow. Yet for some, the experience deepened faith, humbled pride, or turned hearts toward repentance. To lie awake in darkness, hearing only one breath in prayers, was to confront the soul directly, with no labor or laughter to distract. For the community, the prison stood bend symbol to walk past the castle tower, and no men were chained within, was both unsettling and reassuring. Unsettling, for the thought of such darkness chilled the heart; reassuring, for it meant justice was vigilant, that criminals were held, that order endured. The very sight of barred windows or iron doors carried weight, warning all of the cost of crime. At night, when villages and towns fell silent, prisons remained restless, chains clinked, prisoners shifted, voices murmured in dreams or prayer, footsteps of guards echoed on stone. Beyond the walls, owls saw, dogs barked, bells told the hours. Within, time dragged endlessly, rocked only by the sound of keys turning in locks, by the faint hope that one day freedom might return. Thus the prison and the dungeon were more than stone and chain. They were the shadow side of law. Men and women learned the price of crime in silence and confinement. Bodies endured cold and hunger, and where souls wrestled with despair and hope. Though gallows and lash struck swiftly, the dungeon struck slowly, each day a wound, each night a judgment, each hour a reminder that justice could cage well it kill. In the medieval mind, sin and crime were never far apart. To break the law was to offend not only king or lord, but God himself. Theft, murder, perjury, and adultery were crimes against community, yet also sins against heaven. And as the sins, though hidden from human eyes, were confessed high crimes in the secrecy of the confessional. Thus the Church stood not only as healer of souls, but also as judge of earthly wrongs, its shadow falling across every dispute and punishment. The Church itself offered sanctuary. A fugitive pursued for theft or bloodshed might dash through the churchyard, fling himself against the doors, and clutch the altar with trembling hands. There, under the holy roof, he was safe, for to drag him out by force was sacrilege. The law might circle, the sheriff might fume, but the man at the altar was shielded by God peace. For days, sometimes weeks, he might remain, fed by kin or pitying townsfolk, sleeping by candles, whispering prayers for mercy. But sanctuary was not escape. The law demanded choice, either face trial or confess and accept exile. Some fugitives admitted guilt, abjured the realm, and were led barefoot to the edge of kingdom, staff in inn, never to return. Others lingered until hunger or despair drove them out. Facing court at last, sanctuary gave pause, not pardon. It was mercy enough to prevent immediate death, but not always enough to save. Ecclesiastic courts judged matters of the spirit, yet their reach was wide. Clergy accused of crime were tried not in secular courts, but before bishops. Students at universities claimed benefit of clergy, their learning granting them the same privilege. For many, this meant lighter sentences, penance, fines, loss of office, but rarely lash or gallows. To common folk, this seemed unfair. Why should a censored head or a scholar cap shield from rope? Murmurs of resentment grew, yet the system endured, for the church authority was vast. The church all judged sins, not named crimes, by kings. Adultery, incest, usury, heresy, all fell under ecclesiastic law. Accused men and women stood before bishops or archdeacons, confessing failings of flesh or conscience. Punishments were often penances, fasting, pilgrimage, prayers repeated by the hundreds, sometimes public confession in church. for the soul was thought more precious than the body, and correction more valuable than pain. Yet shade weighed heavily, and the memory of standing exposed before one parish stunned for years. Confession itself blurred the line between sin and crime. A man might kneel before priest, whispering theft, assault, even murder. The seal of confession bound the priest to silence. He could not reveal what he heard, even to save a life. Yet penance could be imposed, restitution required, journeys of pilgrimage demanded. Thus many crimes were addressed in secret, shaped into spiritual correction rather than public punishment. Whether this brought true justice was debated even then, but the sanctity of confession remained inviolate. Sometimes church and town clashed. A murderer fled to sanctuary. The sheriff demanded his surrender. The bishop insisted on mercy. A priest accused of theft was claimed by ecclesiastic court, while villagers demanded he face the pillory like any other. Heretics condemned by bishops were handed to secular powers for execution. The church itself unwilling to shed blood yet complicit in death. The boundaries wavered, negotiated case by case, the balance between mercy and severity shifting like shadow across stone. For villagers, the church role was both comfort and confusion. They saw neighbors spared gallows by benefit of clergy, yet they also saw sinners shamed upon altars. They believed sanctuary holy, yet they feared criminals slipping free. They confessed sins great and small, whispering what could not be spoken in courts, yet they lived under sheriffs who punished openly and harshly. The dual weight of law, earthly and heavenly, pressed upon them always, sometimes at odds, sometimes entwined. Still, the church offered something secular justice could not, hope of redemption, where the sheriff broke rope, the priest brought penance. Where the gallows ended life, the altar promised forgiveness. Even those condemned to die found solace in last confession, believing their souls cleansed though their bodies swung. The church softened justice, even as it sometimes sharpened it, ensuring that sin was never only crime, and crime never only sin. At dusk, when bells tolled for vespers, villagers reflected on both laws. They remembered the stocks, the lash, the gallows. They remembered, too, the altar, the confessional, the whispered absolution. Between fear and hope, shame and mercy, their lives unfolded, bound by both crown and church. Thus crime and sin, justice and penance, gallows and altar stood side by side, two faces of one order. To live in the medieval world was to walk always between them, fearing punishment yet hoping for forgiveness, trembling before law yet trusting in grace. In that tension, fragile and enduring, the soul and the body alike were held to account. Law was not only lived in courts and punishments, it was also told in stories, sung in ballads, whispered by hearths, for in the medieval world, tales carried justice into imagination, shaping how villagers thought of crime, punishment, and the thin line between outlaw and hero. Ballads of outlaws filled taverns and fairs. Minstrels sang of men who dwelt in the greenwood, robbing rich travelers, sharing spoils with the poor, outwitting sheriffs and lords. Their names were men, some true, uninvented, some blurred by memory. The most famous, Robin Hood, was sung of long before his tales were written, a figure of defiance against harsh law, a thief yet a giver, a sinner yet a kind of saint in March mind. Children clapped at his clever tricks, men nodded dimly, women smiled at his mercy. Whether he truly lived mattered little. The legend carried hope that justice might be more than lash and rope. Other stories warned rather than inspired. tales of bandits caught and hanged, their bodies left to rot on gallows hills, stories of Lyle exposed, their perjury punished by festering wounds, legends of witches burned by fire, their curses extinguished in smoke. Such stories chilled hearts, teaching that crime would not escape divine or earthly justice. Mothers hushed children with them, neighbors reminded one another, priests wove them into sermons. Stories traveled farther than courts. A punishment seen in one town became tale in another, embroidered and repeated until truth and invention merged. In such a place, people said, a thief ear was nailed to the church door. In such a market, a false baker was dragged through the streets with stones in his bread. Memory became myth, myth became warning, and warnings lived longer than parchment rolls. Even saints' lives carried lessons of justice, stories told of holy men who judged disputes with wisdom, of miracles revealing guilt, of sinners forgiven and transformed. These tales blended law with faith, reminding all that true justice belonged to God, that even the guilty might be redeemed. At night, when work was done and families sat by the fire, stories of crime and punishment passed from mouth to ear, shaping children's fears and hopes. They learned that theft wrote stocks, lies bought shame, murder wrote rope. Yet they also learned that cleverness might outwit cruelty, that mercy might triumph, that the poor might be defended against the strong. Thus legend softened the harshness of law, weaving imagination into the stern fabric of justice. Crime was not only a fact of life, but a story told, sung, and remembered. In tales, justice could be cruel, but it could also be kind. Though gallows stood give upon the hill, the songs of greenwood heroes and cautionary tales carried law into dreams. We punishment and hope walked side by side. The tale of crime and punishment in the medieval world is not only a tale of cruelty and fear, it is also a tale of balance, of two forces bound together, shadow and light, justice and mercy. For though the stocks and gallows loomed, though dungeons were dark and ordeals cruel, still there remained the hope of pardon, of forgiveness, of grace. The medieval soul lived always between these two, dreading the weight of law, and trusting that mercy might soften its hand. Justice was stern, it demanded order, for without order the fragile life of the village could not endure. To steal was to threaten hunger, to fight was to endanger peace, to kill was to tear the fabric of community itself. Law responded harshly, to mend what was broken, to warn others, to bind men and women together again in the shadow of consequence. The steward fines, the sheriff gallows, the king justice, they were heavy, but they gave shape to life, a boundary within which work and worship could continue. Yet mercy was never absent. Lords would pardon, priests would absolve, kings could grant reprieve. A thief who stole out of hunger might be spared death, fined instead, or sent on pilgrimage. A murderer confessing with tears might be shriven before rope claimed him, soul saved though body lost. Villages themselves could forgive, neighbors agreeing to set quarrels with handshake and oath rather than blows. Even the stocks, cruel though they seemed, were less than death, leaving room for repentance and return. Mercy flowed most strongly through the church. In confession, sins were forgiven, penances given not to destroy but to heal. Pilgrimage turned crime into devotion, fasting into cleansing, prayer into restoration. At the altar, the sinner knelt side by side with the honest man, both receiving the same host, both bound by the same hope of grace. And when death approached, even for the condemned, priests whispered absolution, reminding all that God mercy was greater than man law. This tension shaped medieval life. Villagers feared the sheriff, but they also trusted the priest. They dreaded the gallows, yet they prayed for pardon. They told children of stocks and whips, but also of saints' mercy, of Christ forgiving thieves upon the cross. Justice guarded the community, mercy guarded the soul. Both were needed, both were true. At times the balance tipped too far toward cruelty. Innocents suffered false oaths, harsh sheriffs, unjust lords, crowds jeered with glee, men were beaten for getting pity, bodies hung too long upon gallows, dungeons grew too full, ordeals scar those undeserving. These shadows cannot be denied, yet always within them voices tall for compassion, priests pleading for clemency, neighbors speaking in defense, rulers granting pardon to hoe their generosity. Mercy, though sometimes faint, endured. In the quiet of evening, when punishments were done and crowds dispersed, villagers returned to hearths, reflecting on what they had seen. They whispered to children, "Do not steal, do not lie, do not fight," warning of pain and shame. Yet they also whispered prayers, "God forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." Between warning and prayer, fear and hope, they lived. Thus, crime and punishment in the medieval world was not only about stocks and gallows, but about the constant weaving of law and grace. Justice stood to protect the fragile peace of community. Mercy stood to remind that even the guilty were souls, beloved still of God. Together they shaped life, harsh the winter winds, gentle viz spring rain. So the story ends not at the gallows nor in the dungeon, but in the quiet hope that mercy might prevail, that forgiveness might bawl punishment, that compassion might soften cruelty, that even in the stern face of justice, the smile of grace might be glimpsed. For the medieval world, harsh though it was, held always to this truth: justice may guard, but mercy redeems.